Welcome back to the last panel of the conference. I'm pausing because one of the panelists is the one holding court in front of the conference. So welcome back. This is the last panel of the conference, and it's going to be facilitated by Mongiseni Buthelezi. Shenge, take over.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you had a good lunch. I'm in the business of naming and shaming now, so ungovernable people, you all got called out. I'm looking at you, Faisal Randera. Okay, let me start with the good news. I'm sorry for people who are flying out after this next panel. But after the end of the next panel and the closing remarks from Lawson Naidu, we are I'm stealing Lawson's thunder, by the way. He was gonna say this. We are gonna open the bar and you are welcome to join us for a drink. And this is an incentive. We've been talking about incentivizing things here. It's an incentive to stay for the last session. Now, we've come to the final session. And here, really, we want to think about how do we take all of this forward. We've talked about a whole range of initiatives that are on the go. Different colleagues in the room told us about work that they're doing, the work of writing legislation, the work of various panels that government is running, that people are serving on, the NACAC, etc. We want to think about how do we implement the recommendations, the proposals that are in the Zondo Commission. We have also heard, of course, in this panel that some recommendations that Zondo has made are not very good. So what we cannot do, of course, is now start campaigning for everything in the Commission's report to be implemented, because some of it is dreadful, I'm afraid to say. And we've pointed out some of those shortcomings. We've pointed out some of the blind spots, some of the lacunae, some of the things that the Zondo Commission was unable to get to. Given the work that you are all doing, that different civil society bodies are doing, that journalists are doing, etc., how do we take all of this forward? How do we, from the places where you sit, from the work that you're doing, what are the possibilities you see? And I'm joined here by a panel of three. The fourth speaker, unfortunately, is now unable to join us. And in the order in which they are going to speak, Professor Themba Maseko, who's the Director of Executive Education at the Wits School of Governance. And he needs no introduction, of course, but I'll say a little bit more about him. He's the former government spokesperson. Many of us used to see him on television in that role. Former CEO of GCIS and a former DG of a number of national departments as well. He's the author of For My Country, which was published in 2021, and gave testimony relating to GCIS at the State Capture Commission, which we watched with absolute fascination. He'll be followed by Zen Mathe, who's an investigator at Open Secrets, who's also, I should say, played a phenomenal role in holding us together in that grouping that was mentioned yesterday, the Civil Society Working Group on State Capture, that engaged with the Commission, criticized the Commission, but also defended the Commission when it was necessary, when it was under attack. Zen also worked at the Center for Complex Systems in Transition at the University of Stellenbosch, where she engaged in research around state capture and governance. And she's currently coordinating, of course, the CSWG. We were meant to be joined next also by Songezo Zibi, but then the Queen died. Songezo, who is going to be joining us from London, and all his meetings have been moved around. So he's in a meeting right now and he's unable to join us. So we have apologies from Songezo Zibi. And last, but certainly not least, Erin Bates. Thank you for joining us, who is a legal writer for Business Day and previously anchored news on ANCA, where she reported on the state capture inquiry from 2018 to 2020. She also published work with Al Jazeera, with Daily Maverick, with the Financial Mail, News 24, and Freya Viekblad. Thank you very much. With that, over to you, Professor Maseko.
Connected. Okay, thank you for that great introduction. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists and to all of you, the delegates at this conference. When I was invited, I was told I had an hour to speak. And when I arrived here, I'm told I've got 10 or 15 minutes. So, so I'm going to try and be as quick as possible. Just a few introductory remarks. My sense is that the Zondo Commission indicates quite a number of major issues that need our attention, that we have a crisis of governance in this country, and I'm sure you've talked a lot about that. There's also a crisis of legitimacy, with people losing confidence in the ruling elite for poor governance that we're experiencing in the country. We have an accountability deficit, where those in power actually are refusing to take accountability for things that are going wrong in our society. Corruption has become endemic. And I think it's important for us to note that even during the days of the Zondo Commission, when it was sitting, there were actors who were participating in all kinds of corruption in various parts of government. So the fact that there was a commission investigating state capture doesn't mean that, in fact, it stopped. It still continued during that period. So it's important for us to note. What are the risks in this conversation? For me, the first risk is that the country has had lots of commissions in the past investigating different kinds of things, and we can give a number of examples in that regard. But most of those recommendations were not implemented by government. So that is a risk that, in fact, even this report could end up in our bookshelves without any significant implementation. And we can give examples of the Truth Commission, Amsdale, Marikana, et cetera, and we can't afford that to happen. And the point I'm making here is that we can't afford government's response to this commission report to be a PR exercise. We need to see action, because failure to do so means that we're actually risking undermining confidence in state institutions in the eyes of our citizens, but most importantly, loss of confidence in an important instrument, and that is the instrument of judicial commissions of inquiry. We still have gonna have lots of problems in the country, and we need judicial commissions of inquiry. And if there's no implementation, people are going to lose confidence in these tools. The next key risk is that the ruling elite is implicated in this report, as you all know, and there will be attempts to undermine the commission in one form or the other. And already there are reports that the so-called Stalingrad approach is being adopted by those who are implicated in the report. So we clearly have to guard against that. It's my view that government needs to take full responsibility and accountability for failures that led to state capture, but we must not allow government to do what I call cherry picking, choose which recommendations to implement and only choose those that will suit the ruling elite. The state also has a major responsibility of providing resources to law enforcement agencies. And in this regard, I'm quite pleased to note that more money is being channeled into the NPA to make sure that, in fact, prosecutions can actually happen as quickly as possible, and it needs capacity. Because we've got to note that the reason why the Zondo Commission was able to do the work that it did and produce such a sterling report was because of the resources that were made available to the commission. It was able to get experts to get involved, and it is estimated that up to R1 billion has been spent on the Zondo Commission. It's an indication that, in fact, if you want to do a proper job on state capture in particular and corruption in general, you got to make resources available. So state or law enforcement agencies need to be capacitated through resource allocation. It's my view that, in fact, we need to find ways of making sure that we get government to commit to timeframes to implement the recommendations that we identify as priorities. Government must also emulate what I call best practice here. We've already seen good examples where the British government, for example, decided to act against Spain and said they will not be given work in the UK government. And you know, the American government also took some action against one or two of their companies. So the issue of acting as government and identifying best practice, in my view, is important. And that includes cancelling contracts of all those companies that were implicated in state capture. They need to be blacklisted. We need to ensure that there's prosecution of those who were involved in state capture, but also seizing their assets to make sure that, in fact, there's greater accountability. Protection of whistleblowers. You've talked about this in one of the sessions, and I was watching it online, so I don't need to say much about it. Chair, as you can see, I prepared a PowerPoint, but I forgot that I'm actually talking to civil society, so there won't be any PowerPoint presentations here. What does civil society do? Well, firstly, I think it's an important role that you're already performing, and it is to mobilize society and make sure that we keep the pressure on, but we need to go beyond that. We need to make policy proposals that are aimed at influencing government policy to make sure that we don't see state capture again. You need to create platforms to educate society, and these platforms must appeal to all of us, go beyond the elites. So a lot of these platforms need to find ways of actually making sure that we get contributions and inputs from ordinary citizens, because the fact that we're in organizations or academics or this and that doesn't mean that we're the only ones who must actually play a role in terms of making policy proposals. And obviously, civil society is playing a key role in this regard, and that is supporting whistleblowers. And support here, we're talking psychosocial support, financial support, but also providing security, because many, I should include myself, of us do face security concerns, especially as we're approaching the period of prosecution of those who are implicated in state capture. But civil society, in my view, I'm including professional bodies that need to play a key role. And in this regard, I propose that they need to act against their own members. We need to see suspensions by various professional bodies that exist. They need to strengthen their own regulatory frameworks. They need to educate their members about ethics, and then support and strengthen state capacity. I think that's very important. But in this whole work, we also need to make sure that we utilize expertise that's lying, I almost said idle, but that's lying in universities, where when we're identifying policy issues, we can actually make sure that we approach universities and work with academics and experts where they can actually help us strengthen recommendations. The report didn't say I must talk about citizens, but I think it's important to talk about the role of citizens. They need to hold leaders accountable. They need to participate, or citizens need to participate actively in anti-corruption campaigns. They need to be vigilant and report all forms of corruption, be it big or small. But most importantly, we need to find ways of educating our citizens not to participate in corruption themselves. I mean, there are small things that we often don't think about as serious. Paying a bribe to a traffic officer is an act of corruption and indication of declining ethics. So we mustn't see it as something that needs to apply to the ruling elite, but even ourselves as citizens, we need to ensure that we don't act in corrupt and unethical ways. But the citizens must also contribute and participate in discussions and debates, such as the ones that we are having today. All of us agree that the Zondo Commission report is bulky, sometimes complex, and not accessible to ordinary citizens. And I think we can play a key role in our publications, in our platforms, to just simplify the report and get citizens to understand what the report was essentially about. Next key topic is the role of the private sector. Firstly, I think the private sector needs to be present and stop paying lip service to fighting corruption. So we need to see specific things that they need to do. And in my view, the private sector needs to also clean up its own act. And this includes business organizations suspending or expelling their members, companies that are their members that participated in state capture but are also implicated in other forms of corruption. For example, the likes of Bain, who were members of the BLSA, Business Leadership SA, were suspended and were taken back as soon as they pay the fine. But it's my view that in fact what they did was not sufficient. So business organizations also need to lead by example. They need to cancel contracts of implicated companies and individuals that are providing services to these companies that were complicit in state capture. Business organizations also need to develop and enforce an anti-corruption charter for business. So in other words, we should not fall into the trap of making business to believe that corruption is happening in government and that there isn't corruption within their own ranks. So they need to lead by example as far as that is concerned, and obviously support civil society initiatives, resourcing primarily, and also support whistleblowers. The fact that whistleblowers actually battle to find employment in business organizations, in companies, in my view, is an indictment on our business leadership in the country. In conclusion, I'm almost running out of time. It's my view that the primary body that is responsible for the implementation of the recommendations is obviously government, but government must work with tertiary institutions, civil society, and other social partners to make sure that we identify the systemic issues that have led to the state capture to take place in our country, and also strengthen existing recommendations that are contained in the report. Based on your opening remarks, it's clear that even this forum has identified weaknesses with the Zondo Commission report. So in my view, this is a window of opportunity for us to come up with policies that will strengthen our democracy by identifying those institutions that require strengthening. But it's in my view, in conclusion, that there's still a lot of work to be done. All of us know that the Zondo Commission only focus on national government and SOEs, but the untouched corruption that is taking place at local government level is something that all of us should be concerned about. And at this stage, there isn't work that is done to actually analyze and assess what needs to be done at that level. So Chair, with those few opening remarks, I'd like to hand over back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Zen, next.
Hello? Is it on? Oh, yes. Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon to my panelists and everybody in the room. It's not an easy task to be the last panel of a 2-day conference, but on top of that, being tasked with thinking through how do we implement the recommendations. I'm Zen Mathe, as Bongthini, our chair, has introduced me. I'm an investigator at Open Secrets, and this afternoon I'm speaking to the civil society working group on state capture and the work that we've done, and the way that we can think through implementing the recommendations of the Zondo Commission. Open Secrets convenes the civil society working group on state capture, but the CSWG is made up of over 20 civil society organizations. Now, you know, it's one thing to be the secretariat and to convene 20 plus civil society organizations, but it's another thing for those individual civil society organizations to stay committed to a process. I mean, you can take the horses to the water, but you can't make them drink. And so really it's been a lot of hard work from each and commitment from the individual civil society organizations that has made the CSWG able to continue to work over the course of 4 years. So as we think through implementing the recommendations, just a little bit of context. The CSWG was established in 2018. Shortly after the establishment of the Zondo Commission that same year. And in a context in which, you know, the previous year there was sustained public pushback against the Zuma administration. You know, we had the release of the Gupta leaks, we had the ushering in of the New Dawn. There was a sense of after the public protector released the state of capture report and the establishment of the Zondo Commission, a sense of a breath of fresh air from civil society and a sense of hope. And a sense of handing over the baton, so to speak, to the Zondo Commission at the time to continue the work of what had culminated towards the end of 2017. And I think what was happening there was an atmosphere of a post-state capture era. Little did we know that that was the time to not put the foot off the accelerator, but to rev it even more. And the coming together of the Civil Society Working Group was civil society organizations recognizing at the time that instead of us now handing over the baton as civil society, now is the time to take this as what we called at the time the window of opportunity. And knowing that we're a country of commissions, we had met the establishment of the Zondo Commission with credible skepticism. We look back at the Sarita Commission and we know that the establishment of a commission isn't necessarily the time to breathe. And so these civil society organizations came together and what happened after that was a commitment not to only have a conversation, not to say conversations like this aren't important, but it was not only to have a conversation, but to really think through what can we actually do? What are the actionable steps we can take following this? And that's when we came together and decided that we'd be making submissions to the Zondo Commission, which Mr. Terence Mbembe had mentioned happened throughout the life of the commission. But other than that, there was a commitment to say, supporting the work of the commission is one thing, but remaining critical of the work of the commission is another. And so holding this line between how do we do both of those things during the life of the commission was one of the challenges that the working group faced. And at every interval where there was, a trade-off between protecting the commission, holding the commission accountable, and supporting the work of the commission. We had over 20 civil society organizations going back and forth about how do we do that. And how the Civil Society Working Group managed to hold all three of those balls was to really to say that there are moments to push back, there are moments to protect, and there are moments to apply pressure. And so it almost was really a steering of recognizing when is the time to apply pressure and when is the time to support. And really when it comes to now implementing the recommendations, what we've learned is that we have now a history of 4 years to look back on. We have lessons to draw on that we didn't have when the Civil Society Working Group was starting at the time. And we've learned that there are a couple of things that happen. Having short-term action-based goals as a working group is one of the main ways to maintain public engagement around the issues that often seem so far removed from the public discussion. And not just having short-term action-based points of engagement, but to bring those into the public conversation and thinking creatively about how we do that. And one of the examples that we have as the working group is #DearJudgeZondo, which was a way that the Civil Society Working Group allowed the public to make submissions to the Zondo Commission to say #DearJudgeZondo, this is how I feel about what is going on around state capture and corruption in our country, and to think creatively around the lessons we've learned about how to bring the public into conversation. So when we're thinking about bringing our recommendations into implementation, the importance of popular education, but not only for that sake itself, but to sustain public pressure and to get the conversation going and to utilize tools like social media and hashtags to bring the government and the people into a conversation where you can't not be held to account when the conversation and the pressure continues to be building. And while holding that space of bringing down the conversation and being one of the ways that we can push for the implementation of the recommendations, we can also understand that the carving of the cake is one of the ways that the Civil Society Working Group has really made submissions. So when we're looking at how do we choose what submissions to make to the Zondo Commission, the same way when we're thinking through, there's these reams of recommendations, how do we strategically not cherry pick, so to speak, how do we strategically apply our collective pressure to those that we need to push forward? And that happens by playing to our strengths as different civil society organizations that are working on different areas. So this is the way that the Civil Society Working Group has decided it's going to be building a implementation of recommendations tracker and engaging around which recommendations work are we going to put our collective pressure behind and collective force behind. But on top of that, how do we put our foot and pressure around the work that we already are doing to help us make tangible tracking systems of those implementations. And if we marry that to the work we're already doing in a lot of our areas of work and areas of focus, it'll allow that division of labor and the tangible output of seeing that through. And beyond that, another thing is strategic pressure points. So when it comes to the role of government, the Zondo Commission has handed over its recommendations to the presidency, and the presidency has to respond now in October, and the parliament and report to parliament. And beyond that, that is the role of the government. So it almost happens as we've seen as the country of commissions, that's what happens, and then there's a lull. And so us applying strategic pressure as the Civil Society Working Group would be to galvanize and to continue to pressurize the government around that, and to ensure that beyond parliamentary submissions and continuing to wait for feedback and to apply pressure for feedback, that is a strategic pressure point that we can apply pressure to. And the third thing I would like to just stress about how we can implement the recommendations is that we've spoken about a considered civil society response to the recommendations and the work of the Commission. And when I say considered civil society response is to pull the work together that the Zondo Commission has done and to provide an actual civil society analysis from the different organizations that we're then able to put into a publication, and it can live on as this civil society working groups and civil society's considered response to the life and the work of the Commission. And so those are the two, the corruption tracker, the implementation tracker, and the release of the publication of a considered response from civil society. And beyond that, the in-between parts of how do we action those steps is in the strategic pressure and in the strategic engagement and in playing to our strengths and making sure that we work together to see that through. When it comes to players such as the private actors and how we continue to as a civil society working group, how we continue to ensure that implementations of recommendations are done in that area. In something, as we've seen, the Zondo Commission has come on strong in some areas, in instances such as Bain, and it's come off weak in other areas, in instances such as the bank. And what the considered civil society response will do differently to tracking the implementation of the recommendations is really to say, these are the areas where we've fallen short, and these are the areas where we need a bigger push following the Zondo Commission report and the recommendations. And so it's in those two areas that we really think that we'll be able to ensure the implementation of the recommendations. And then also just to draw on the actionable steps. We held a people's hearing on state capture in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. And what happened at the people's hearing on state capture is it was the plan from the civil society organization following the making of the submissions to say there are people that aren't in the room. And that is a problem, and that is something that we need to change. Who are we giving voice to? Who are we engaging with? And how do we how do we ensure that the South African public, those affected, all of us in the country, are represented in the work that we do. And then we hosted the People's Hearing on State Capture, where the public was allowed to come and give testimony to what effect state capture has had in their own communities. And beyond that, if you couldn't join in person, which we had lots of people coming and telling their stories about textbooks not being delivered, about waiting for ambulances for up to 24 hours. And we took those hearings, those public hearings, and we linked them to the submissions that we'd made to the Zondo Commission. And we merged that into an agenda for action where we made a joint submission that pulled together all the recommendations from the different civil society organizations and the findings from the People's Hearing. And so, looking at the way that we always try to make sure that who are we representing and who are we giving a platform to, and how we are linking what we're doing in this boardroom and in this conversation to those of us in the public who are not in this room that are most affected, is another of the important ways that implementing those recommendations and bringing those same people into the conversation in a similar way will be a really important contribution, and thinking through how we'll do that as the CSWG and what that might look like is a conversation we still need to have, but something we've agreed is extremely important. Otherwise, all of this was for naught, so to speak. And I think I'll leave the rest to the discussion session. But yeah, thank you, Chair.
Goodness, the bar's been set pretty high by my fellow panelists. And thanks very much for the opportunity. I think this is a really valuable conversation, and it comes at a prudent time as we wait for the President's input on the recommendations of the report. So just a reminder, I'm Erin Bates. I'm the legal writer at Business Day. For the first 2 years of the commission, I worked as a reporter at ENCA, sitting through day after day of testimony on everything from the Gupta's Saxonwold Shebeen to, almost watching paint dry, hearing about locomotive procurement, trying to find creative ways of telling those important stories about state capture that would really make them real and tangible to the public. And then hearing about Bosasa. And I mean, everything at that commission went from the sublime to the ridiculous. So as much as I'm here to sort of speak on how we take these recommendations forward, I do think I've sort of got more value to add in terms of sitting in the room and hearing your testimony, for example, amongst many others. And that ties in with this idea of what is the role of the media moving forward. And I think before looking into that, we have to think about, well, what was the role of the media during the commission and even prior? Because of course, the genesis of the commission was the Public Protector's State of Capture report. And some of what she was looking at was informed by what had been in the press. We knew even before 2013 and Guptagate and the Waterkloof landing and the scandals around providing passports and visas to Gupta employees at Sahara Computers and other companies, that there was something afoot. And that momentum just kept on building and kept on building. And the work of investigative journalists in particular, which is such a niche in the industry and a shrinking one at that. We have organizations like Amabungane that sort of skirt now being news entities and also NGOs, have done incredible work against the odds and without resources. And so I think one practical thing we can do moving forward is provide funding to non-government organizations in civil society that do quasi-journalistic work. Open Secrets is one example on that score. CASAC has litigated on state capture matters, and no one's put me up to saying this. I genuinely believe that this is important to do. And then also advocating for investigative journalism, where you see a publication that's doing good work, they've touched on an important theme and you think there's more to it, or indeed from your own work, motivate to those publications to do more, to dig further, because journalists and newsrooms do care about what audiences, what readers, what South Africans think about what we're covering. So those are some practical things. I think also important to remember that, of course, the media was embroiled in state capture. We heard about what was happening at ANN7, the notorious SABC breakfasts with people sitting around, shoulder rubbing, the hoi polloi sitting there, getting their morning fill as they enjoyed the fruits of state capture and sketchy procurement, one bite at a time. We know what happened at GCIS. Extensive cross-examination, for example, of Mzwanele Momanyi on his role at GCIS after other colleagues had been shunted. And so you see that media is not homogenous, that journalists are not always on the good side, and that's something to bear in mind moving forward. I do think in terms of strategic communication, there was a massive own goal on the part of the Commission. Poor Reverend Mbuyiselo Stimela was the one-man band running communication for that commission for 4 years. He had some health problems, which is entirely understandable. You have to have indefatigable commitment to work on the commission, whether it's as the chair, as members of the legal team, as investigators, as journalists. I mean, I got completely burned out. I honestly don't know how Zondo did it, never mind the threats to his personal safety and the public scrutiny, which is justified. We need to be rigorous in how we frame and understand and analyze the commission. But I do think the commission could have done far more to make its value felt in the general public. And that applies to the report we're sitting with now. I mean, June, in the union buildings, seeing the final report, which we as the press never got as a printed hard copy. So Lord knows how many printers were steaming in newsrooms as people were trying to get out the pages to annotate. It was literally as tall as me. I'm not the tallest of people, but it's mammoth. And I haven't read the whole thing. To be candid, I haven't. I hope there's someone in this room who has and has retained all that information, but I haven't. And you know, we still need to hear from the president. We still need to see how we move this forward, but we also need to remember what the commission is. And there are a couple of things I think are important to raise here. It's not a very genteel phrase, but my grandmother would say, you can't expect more than a grunt from a pig. And so the work of the commission is not the work of the NPA. It's not the work of the ID. It's not the work of the Hawks. And there was no impediment to them beginning that work, even as the commission was doing its hearings. Of course, practically speaking, there were impediments. It had been hauled out, the NPA, for example. You know, law enforcement was completely corroded and corrupted under state capture. But bear in mind that those organizations are going to be responsible for litigating. And I can tell you now, we are 2 weeks away from the end of September. The head of the NPA, Advocate Shamila Batoy, in her optimism, promised us back in April, May, beg your pardon, that there would be 9 seminal cases within 6 months. 3 are enrolled at this point. So that's not to say that there aren't other state capture matters. Ronald Lamola, Justice Minister, had said back in February, there were scores of them. I'll get the details now. But Batoy promised 9 seminal cases would be enrolled. There are only 3 at this point. They have 11 working days to meet a self-imposed deadline, and I'm doubtful that they will meet it. And alarmingly, I haven't been able to get clarity from the NPA spokesperson, or indeed to a degree from the ID spokesperson, bless them, they've got a lot on their shoulders. What's happening? And it does suggest a degree of lack of resources, lack of coordination, and simply being overwhelmed by the storm of state capture. And I have to say, sitting in that room hour after hour after hour of testimony, it almost numbed you. It got to a point where it became so ordinary that crazy things were happening. That Angelo Agrizzi was sitting on holiday at Umhlanga Rocks, getting a phone call because Linda MT wanted a pair of shoes from the same, collier who gives shoes to the Pope. And he has to go and swipe the Bosasa business card. It's the same thing as sitting and listen to Norma Ngoma, who I thought was a really powerful witness for the layperson, because she said in such frank terms, this is what happened. That's where the bags went. You know, the testimony that engages the public is the palpable stuff, the tangible stuff. And then the work of journalists becomes trying to make the more complicated, sophisticated state capture crimes available and digestible to the public. And we don't have a lot of resources, and I do think that is where academia, civil society, and professionals can help us. If you have a particular skill set in your team around data analysis, for example, or strategic communication, and you can take the state security chapter of the Zondo report and do a dummies guide in a really user-friendly infographic, please provide it. I can motivate my editor for us to include that and credit you. Or a dummies guide to what we learned about GCIS, or ESCOM. These things are incredibly complicated, and that serves state capturers who are trying to cover up their tracks. It serves the likes of Matsela Koko, who is incredibly sharp and incredibly sophisticated, and he was damn good at his job at times. But he can talk circles around you, and so we need to distill and clarify that information as we move forward. And so the other thing I just want to say on the Commission broadly is that I do think there are lessons in terms of how it was run. The work streams are incredibly haphazard. It was one day ESCOM, next day PRASA, and they did try, but I think the forward planning around that is something that really, really undid them. And also bear in mind that the team changed over the years. Vincent Maleka, for example, was on the legal team at the beginning, incredibly strong on ESCOM. Later, we lost him. There were other silks that joined and provided value, but often they were doing it at a lower rate than they should have been paid, and sometimes the taps were closed, and that may well have been strategic. And I think then just lastly to say, as we sort of think about things moving forward, and this has sort of been like a stream of consciousness, so forgive me, the archive of the Commission, I mentioned this to Lawson on a cheeky smoke break during lunch, but I spoke to Vern Harris, who worked with the TRC, and I do think the TRC in many ways did a great job of getting public buy-in. It was in the heady days of the Rainbow Nation and rewriting the narrative of sort of, negotiated transition in South Africa, fair enough. The Zondo Commission had a different sort of function in terms of public narrative, national narrative. How are we going to make sense of what is state capture and supposedly move into the Tumamina era? Those heady days of Buffalo time and cleanup that have all become pretty drab with the dating of the Ramaphosa administration. But what Vern Harris said about the TRC was the value of the archive. And the Zondo Commission has a mine heap of evidence that hasn't been touched on, that hasn't been referred to in the mammoth reports as tall as me. And those resources, those gold nuggets are sitting there dormant. And if support is not provided for the skeleton staff from the Commission who are still trying to tie up those loose ends, and that information isn't properly handled, it will be a wasted opportunity that could possibly help law enforcement litigate and bring people to book. And my throat's getting dry, so I think that's probably a sign that I should shut up. Thank you. I did want to say, just on the bar opening later, I hope that's not a signal that this panel in particular is going to be so crushing that we're all going to need a stiff drink at the end of it.
On the contrary, Erin, this panel is going to be uplifting because we're all going to be thinking about what do we do when we leave here. So thank you very much to the three panelists. I think I want to just add one other thing that we want to do out of this conference. One of the things we're going to do is to put together what we hope is going to be a short, sharp report, which is going to be harvesting a lot of what has been said here about things that need to be done. And what we want to do with that report, of course, is we know there were 3 people from the presidency who signed up for this conference. We hope they've been listening. But we are going to submit that report to them, among other places, so that when they prepare their own submission to Parliament, they've got the benefit of our collective wisdom. So that's one of the things. The other thing I mentioned earlier is we are also wanting, at least at PARI, is we want to put together a collected academic book, which is going to be one of the next steps in sort of trying to start doing deep analysis of the commission itself. I mentioned earlier that we sent off a manuscript to Vets Press yesterday, which is going to come out early next year on state capture. And the next collection we're going to be working on is on the commission itself. With that, I'd like to open it up for discussion. We'll take comments, we'll take offers in the room of things that we should be doing collectively. And as I do that, I also want to just put into the discussion that there are moments, there are opportunities that have been flagged. Opportunities where there's work being done, for example, around, the organizations in the room that are working on developing, we heard from the Active Citizens Movement, developing model legislation, for example, on protecting whistleblowers. So I think there are other opportunities, other initiatives in progress that we need to also be thinking about how we can support. I want to particularly also, alongside the civil society working group on state capture, is recognize the work that the Defend Our Democracy campaign has been doing in amplifying, I think, the voices of a lot of the organizations that are doing work in this space and beginning to really get much broader reach for the work that organizations are doing. And I think, again, we'll have opportunities there around hashtags and such things that we should be thinking around. How do we take these forward? How do we maximize these opportunities? So let's take some discussion. First hand here, second hand, Lisa. Third hand, I think that was the third hand over there. Fourth hand, Michael. Fifth, sixth, Sean. David, did you have your hand up? Okay, seventh. Remember your number. And then there's an eighth hand at the back, and then we'll go to the we'll go to Devi for online comments once. I'm sure they'll come in as we go along. So please remember your number. Number one, who did we say number one was? This gentleman in the front here. And then we'll take another round as we go along.
I was given a brief that I must smile for the camera. Thanks for the opportunity and for the presentation as well. I think the panel did themselves a very good favor. And thanks for bribing us, or personally me, because I was gone until you mentioned alcohol. But on a more serious note, spare thought for civil society organizations. They're trying to do so much with little or nothing in most instances. As an MBA student who want to say the philanthropic capital market is dry. In other words, there are no donations or donors out there. And those who do have the money, they've got deep pockets, but short hands. So oftentimes you find that there's so much that you wish you could do, but you're just constrained by resources. And I'm not talking about huge amounts. I'm talking about just to get something small done. It could be just a report or something else. So the question is, maybe the panel might want to respond to that. What is it that civil society could do to ensure that we could marshal the resources? Because corporate South Africa is not coming to the party. In fact, instead, you look at BLSA, sorry. Membership is about 1 million per company. And I think they've got about how many companies as members? About 75. 90. Oh, okay, thank you. Going, 90 organizations paying a membership fee of 1 million rands each. It just tells you the kind of resources that they have. But I doubt it if they would listen, or they do listen sensitively towards society, that clamor for society, to civil society organizations for assistance. Sometimes it's not even about money. It's about just resources to get by and have something done. What is it that you think civil society could do to try and pressure the likes of BLSA and BUSA to come to the party insofar as unlocking the funding that is sitting out there that could be used, and more importantly, to ensure that you can successfully mount these campaigns to ensure that they don't alienate or malign whistleblowers, many of whom still struggle to find a means to eke out a livelihood. And lastly, talking to your point, Erin, around the archives, we've recently been trying to get some material from the commission. We are working on issue relating to Bain, and there's some important information that we know, that we believe the commission has in their possession, which is not published on their website. Now, when you speak with the people responsible, they'll tell you that we are busy winding down here, and what we have is what you see there, but what you say you want is not there. Give us a break. The question is, do we now issue a PIA application? Remember, I just told you, funding. There's limitation also in terms of, even if you get pro bono assistance, oh, sorry, I'm smiling. Even if you get pro bono assistance, there are also limitations insofar as those law firms that make available or that is at our disposal, the pro bono assistance that you get from them. And when it becomes more like a litigious assistance or request for assistance you're asking of them, chances are more often than not, they tend to not be too excited about it. But also there may also be issues of conflict. They'll tell you, oh, now we've done work for Bain or for the government that Bain was working for, and therefore we might not be able to litigate or be seen to be. So those are some of the things that I just want to pose out there and say, civil society wants to do more to try and put to life the kind of things that the State Capture Commission has unearthed and ensure that there's consequences in a practical manner, because we believe that you cannot wait for the NPA. Because if you're waiting for the NPA, will forever put pressure, it will take forever. Because the NPA is still asking for donations from Steinhoff for 30 million to prosecute PwC or somewhere, or Steinhoff, sorry, So, think about it.
Thanks. There are two issues I want to focus on, which also I think are an attempt to try to insert a somewhat more gendered focus on some of the discussions around what's happening in relation to democracy, state capture, and the like. The first is one I've only just started thinking about, so I have no useful solutions. But I think in relation to electoral reform, one thing to bear in mind is that one of the ways in which one did get more women into parliament was through the proportional representation system. Even though the ANC were the ones who made most use of it, that zebra system actually allowed for women to come in who would not have been considered. So I'm just wondering about what the implications may be on women's representation and trying to push that if we remove those elements of proportional representation. I have no solutions, but I just want to flag it as something to think about. Because I don't think that's something we want to right now. I mean, obviously, if you go in on an ANC ticket, you're ANC first and foremost, and women gender sensitive a very distant second. But I think it's something to just watch so that we don't undo other gains unintentionally. The second is in relation to the Chapter 9s, which are also known as offices for the institutions supporting democracy. We had two speakers in the previous session talk about the Commission for Gender Equality, which has been struggling very, very badly and is something we should look at, because part of its role is to provide oversight that could assist Parliament. It can't do that currently for a couple of reasons. One is the line is blurry here. To what extent is the chair of the Portfolio Committee actively interfering in the Commission, or is she doing her job because the Commission is so dysfunctional? One of the things that I think it points to is the need to have legislation that sets out how one exercises accountability over a Chapter 9 institution. When are you overstepping the boundary and bullying people into particular things? And the reason I ask is that in the last 2-3 years, some of the things that have happened is that the CGE has lost its license to litigate. There have been no attempts to have that license restored, which has implications for the ability to litigate against the state, private sector, or anybody else. What has also happened is that cases that have been brought, or complaints have been made to the Commission that involve very senior government officials, have just gone nowhere. They've died. The complaint against the Deputy Minister of Finance, David Mabaso, is a case in point. I think the other issues that we also need to be thinking about, and people made reference to the letter, is that the idea of public participation, why people should watch this, is if they do this with the CGE, will they not try this again with the other commissions? So their idea of public participation was an Excel spreadsheet with a list of 24 names and their list of qualifications, and a Google form that you can fill in that restricts you to 2,000 characters, which allows you to make 300 to 400 words. And I thank those of organizations who supported the letter opposing that. What it doesn't tell you is that one of those candidates, for instance, is actually being investigated by the Legal Practice Commission because she went off and rewrote a magistrate's decision in the matter where she was representing the plaintiffs. You have another 3 candidates on that list who stood for the ANC in 2019, 2021, and number 3 works in an ANC constituency office. You wouldn't know that. You actually have to go and do the active searching. And you heard the chair's contemptuous dismissal of the attempt to ask for much better public participation. So I think we need to look at those commissions because some people have called them parking spaces, that they're places where you go and dump your loyal cadres. And they need to be looked at because they are there to actively add to oversight. I mean, one of the useful things that the CGE did was to do an investigation into the Department of Health's coercive sterilization of women who are HIV positive. That has disappeared. It's gone nowhere since this new batch of commissioners, who are also trying to undo things like the Commission's former position on the decriminalization of sex work. So who goes there is very, very important. They're actively preventing investigations into government officials, into things that government should not have done, and I think rolling back the gender agenda. And you can call me a conspiracy theorist, but you know, there's something very useful about having a captured gender commission if you're wanting to push a particular woman as president. Just a thought.
They told me I have to stand. But I got my duck with Lewis with me. Oh, I rubbed it a lot, so I think I'm pretty calm now. On the subject of the duck, I was looking at an index the other day, which said that the US was 12, New Zealand was 22nd, Australia was 27th, and South Africa was 30th. And I'm not going to ask anybody to guess because you won't guess what it is. It's the obesity levels of the countries. And when I hear the statement that says it's our time to eat, I say we're probably very, very high there in terms of our obesity. So how do we actually stop this obesity from continuing is to cut the food line. And what are those food lines? Once I heard a head of a German company telling me that he went to the Durban Convention Center, and he said, you know, our table was number 1 and Zuma's was number 2 because we had 60,000 rand suits on. So we were thing. So, you know, my point is you can come with all the legislation, all the policies, but on the ground, what do we actually do to stop this? As a human rights activist, I work close to the ground. So I'm not a policy maker, not a person who's in a think tank. What I do find is that we have very high levels of crime, especially gender-based violence. And the president has referred to it as a pandemic. And he's allocated X amount of money. But how successful are we just dealing with gender-based violence? Something that affects somebody personally. Now we're talking about whistleblowers blowing a whistle where they're not going to be personally affected. Because as I remember reading Themba's book, you know, I don't understand why Themba went to that extent of losing his entire life if he didn't have a conscience that he does. You know, so one of my questions is that everything talks about implementation and what's happened, but who does the measurement and how many measures do we have? I liked the comment from, sorry, I have to write notes. Mental health is not good, eh? I had the comment about measuring impact. So I wanted to know, how do we measure this impact, even if we go to actually implementation?
Thanks very much. I'm trying to look in both places at once. So I'll try and be brief, and I wanted to try and combine 2 points. The one was about the role of the media, just very briefly, something that happened a few weeks ago. And then I wanted to link that to the question of, Zen, you made this point about tracking things, and I wanted to speak in relation to Erin's point about the size of the report and the number of people and entities we want to see prosecuted out of it, and particularly as it relates to the MPA. So the first point on the media, and I think the media and civil society's response, I mean, the one concern I have is the skill and the ability of the private sector actors who are complicit to sanitize their role. So we've spoken a few times in the last couple of days about the News 24 event on state capture. And it was remarkable that the headline sponsor of that event was Nedbank, right? But Justice Zondo recommended that Nedbank was investigated and possibly prosecuted for its role in state capture. The difficulty is not a lot of people will remember that, for one. And of course, Nedbank has been adamant that it will not apologize and that it has done absolutely nothing wrong. And as I said yesterday, unfortunately, the Zondo Commission didn't go into enough depth, I think, about Nedbank's role in Transnet, for example. But I just want to highlight that I think it is a risk that we are much more likely to forget the role of Nedbank because they're so skilled at doing that than we are, for example, about someone like Mosebenzi Zwane. But to link that to my second point, and I promise there is a link, I think one of the things that will be a wonderful tool for civil society more broadly is to have an easily accessible resource that tracks every single person who is recommended for prosecution by the Zondo, or investigation and possible prosecution. So that, and this goes to Erin's point, right? It's so difficult to turn to someone and say, yes, you know, the problem is if you look at page 472 of volume 3 of section 4 of the Zondo Commission report, you'll see a line about this. You already begin to lose people. But one of the things that we are considering at Open Secrets, and I think it would be great to have this as a broader discussion amongst people, is building an online and accessible tool to say, okay, this is everyone. And then the final point, not just from an advocacy perspective, the last thing that I wanted to say is that I think that provides quite a powerful tool to hold the MPA and the Hawks to account. Because Erin makes such an important point, is that if you look at the timeline of promises of the MPA, they are very often promising the same thing every 3 to 6 months, and yet we sometimes don't see action. And when we do see action, it's easy to forget about the other things. So for example, we saw the Transnet arrests. Those are very welcome. We still don't have any explanation from the MPA why no one has been prosecuted for PRASA, despite my understanding of a court order 5 years ago compelling the Hawks and the MPA to act on the evidence against PRASA. And I think unless we have that kind of tool and easily accessible, you know, resource to point to, some of those cases get lost. And just the sheer scale of the information, it makes me worried that that's a possibility.
Thank you. Pops from the Active Citizens Movement. The first point is an appeal to civil society organizations. Please don't work in silos. This job is too big for one person or one organization. We want all hands on deck. I mean, quite often we go into conferences and we hear what organizations doing in pockets. That's good. But I think collectively we can achieve much more. And that's my humble appeal to everybody here and online as well. The second point in relationship to that is civil society organizations and activists in particular demobilized in 1994. And for good reasons as well. We believe that our democratic government will solve all our problems. In fact, contrary to that, they have created more problems. So I think this type of engagement is important, but we need to take it away from campuses into the communities so that we can start rebuilding an active citizenry. Point number 3, we need to put those companies who have been fingered in state capture, we need to put them on terms. And we need to demand reparations and demand that they pay now. We were told yesterday figures are available. So I don't think there's much work that's left to be done to go to the likes of Bain, to go to the likes of KPMG, McKinsey, and say, we want you to pay back what you cost this country. I mean, and you know, the Zondo Commission makes recommendations that every contract in the public service that was awarded to BAME must be investigated. It's not quite a public company, but we know as well, Bain operated in Telkom. I was there. And Telkom is today filing papers against the SIU proclamation by saying that the president is irrational. I mean, how dare these companies, what right do these companies have for them not to be investigated for corruption? We must put them on terms. And then I think finally, allied to the taking these things to the communities, we must put together infographics. What is the cost of corruption in terms of number of houses, schools, clinics, those kind of things? Because when these politicians come to us in 2024 and say, I am going to build you X, Y, and Z, we're going to tell the same politician, but you cost us these things. So thank you very much for this opportunity once again. I think there's some green shoots that I've seen over the last 2 days. We can work better together. And I see a lot of energy here to fix the country. It's the problem is large, but I think we can do it. Thank you very much.
Number 6, who was number 6? Sean, over to you.
No, thank you very much. And I didn't caucus with Pops, but we're more or less wanting to say the same things. If you take the collective of civil society organizations here, how many people can we get into the streets around this issue, even if it's 3 to 4 weeks' time? Would we have more than Operation Dudula? I doubt it. And I doubt it because I think many of us are happy with our work as we do it, but not happy, not seeing the need to actually take our work beyond the confines of our board or immediate people that we work with. And I think that we all need to find ways now of, even if it means adopting a particular area and going to do kind of grassroots work in those communities, it's the work that we all have to begin to do. Because if we don't, then I doubt we will be able to amass the kind of support that is needed to put the pressure and get successful pressure to bring about the changes that we in fact want. So we have between now and the 15th of October, which is more or less the date that the president is supposed to deliver his report to Parliament. What do we do in those 30 days? How do we make sure that before he gives his report to Parliament, he is aware of what it is that this conference and wider society is saying in terms of what they expect that response to be like? Not what he might be asking different departments and entities to advise on what the report must be. So we have an opportunity and a moment to almost within the next 2 weeks or slightly more to emerge with a collective response as to what we think the response needs to be, and also what we intend to do to ensure that there is implementation of as many of those recommendations as possible. But nobody will take us seriously if we are not be able to demonstrate support for what we are talking about. So I think that that's really the critical point that we need to spend some time on as a follow-up from this session. And what I had suggested to you and Lawson is that at least here in this province, and I'm sure in other provinces, the Defend Our Democracy and other collectives would be able to convene wider organizations of communities and civil societies and movements to take the outcome of this conference and, if possible, to agree to endorse them as as a societal response to the Zondo Commission. And if we can do that in different parts of the country, at least there is that signal of wider society response and expectations. We do need simplified versions of this report. We need a very simple PowerPoint presentation, short, not necessarily infographics, but clips that we can go and play in as many community halls as possible. If you take this movie that Riyad Desai did on just the Guptas, that's the kind of movie that we need to screen in every community as far as possible to get this discussion going. Because understanding how movements like Dudula work and others, they're able to take these complex things, simplify them in the most horrible way, but get support for them. We have an issue that links to the collapsed railway systems, to collapsed educational systems, water. Every issue that affects people's lives here has been impacted on by state capture. We need the ability to draw that linkages at the level where people experience those problems. And I think if we do that in a coordinated way, in a much more effective way, we should be able to get thousands of people out onto the streets within weeks and months to come, behind the kind of response that must emerge to this. Because 2023 is going to be a pre-election year. We need to find ways of making sure that the outcomes of this conference and other views around state capture is the issue that parties must respond to in their political manifestos. Because we need that kind of commitment as they go into those elections, and for candidates who are put up, hopefully we get the electoral system changed, which I doubt in time, but it needs to be a political issue around which we then leverage societal support for a particular party or not. So I also want to just express gratitude to the conveners of this. I think it was very important. And I know you were affected by the changing dates of the commission and so forth. And I'm actually happy that it happened when it has. But we have a month to get our act together. Thanks.
Just two points. Something I think that civil society need to do is decide what their priorities are. Even if you just take the question of prosecutions, if you had to weigh up, do you rather want to see, if you had to choose two of Estina, VBS, McKinsey, and Steinhoff or Nedbank, which would you choose? Would you choose to take a tilt at the establishment? Or would you choose to see a prosecution in an area that is most likely to resonate with ordinary people, more likely to galvanize public opinion? And I would go for VBS and Estina, as much as I would die happy to see McKinsey prosecuted. I wouldn't go for one that is only going to resonate in Sandton and in this room, because we know that not everybody who Zondo has suggested be prosecuted is going to be prosecuted. Certainly not in our lifetimes, I think. So I think prioritizing those recommendations that are likely to resonate with the public is really what one wants to do. And related to that, to what Zen said, but it's actually a question to Themba, that if we are to engage in mass public campaigns, civil society always has a scale problem. We can't do that at scale. We can be very effective in selecting what we do select. We can be quite good at social media, but if we want to mount a campaign that uses old media, radio, television, print, we haven't got the scale to do that. And so the question is to Themba, that do you think the GCIS is the right sort of organization to mount a mass campaign of this nature. And I don't say, is it competent or is it capable? I'm saying, is a government communication service anywhere the right service to mount the kind of irreverent, provocative campaign that is necessary for this to get noticed? And if it isn't, are GCS the kind of organization that could commission the sorts of organizations sitting in this room with the kind of resources that they have to run a campaign of this sort?
Thank you very much for this opportunity and this platform. I think for me, a big takeaway is what the panelists just said in terms of moving forward. But I wanted to find out from the panel what examples maybe are guiding us in terms of moving forward. Are we following any blueprints from countries that we are learning from who have experienced this kind of capture, or have been in a situation where they need to make a full-blown transition from a corrupt society to a less corrupt society? Thank you.
Thanks, and hi everyone. I'm Tharan, I'm a researcher with Corruption Watch. I'll make a brief comment, maybe two. The first is a question which I would be interested in people's guesses on, because I don't really have a sense of it, and that's what percentage of the South African population has even heard of the Zondo Commission, or has like a concrete understanding of what it really is? I have no idea. My naive guess is like maybe 30%, but truly I don't know. And I think if we're talking about mobilizing the masses of the country, like, are we speaking from a place of even knowing what I just don't know how these things connect. So I'd be interested to understand that. But then my main contribution I want to make here, you know, when people talk about implementation, the typical response is about a lack of political will. And I think we've heard this again and again. We know what the solutions are. We're a country of great policies. The problem is in implementing them. And that seems true. We're a country of commissions, all of these things. But a theme that's jumped out since the morning, which I'm interested in, is to what extent is this also a problem of coordination between different government bodies? And I guess I mean coordination on two levels here, one on the policy level and one on the institutional level. So in terms of policy, right, we've got the NACS, we've got its 6 pillars, then separately we've got the Zondo Commission and its many, many recommendations. And then we've just got like the whole history of the last 20 years with many white papers and policies and documents in many different areas, as we've heard, you know, public procurement, whistleblowing, parliamentary reform. So those are the policies. And then in the institution, similarly, we have law enforcement agencies tasked with a bunch of different things. And then we have broader institutions that like keep the structures of government running. And I guess you can frame, the framing I'm trying to offer here is one of this lack of coordination within these policies and within these institutions and how they relate to one another. And I'm just trying to understand, like, is this, because I think you can fold in the problem of political will into this problem of coordination, because it seems like there are pockets of will within various institutions, but getting these to all speak to each other and to make some kind of comprehensive like effort is really difficult. So we end up with lots of discussions on public procurement. We end up with the public procurement bill before NEDLAC. We end up with Zondo talking about it, with NACS talking about it, but we don't end up with the sense that there's a collective narrative that all of these things feed into. So from the perspective of civil society, I guess I just want to understand, is this a useful framing to think of as this lack of coordination? And is this something that can shape the messaging and the narratives that we're trying to push in terms of demanding this kind of coordination from government? Like, I'm genuinely not sure if I'm pointing to a real gap, and if so, if it would be useful to point out that gap. But yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Thanks.
And then we'll turn over to our panel.
Yes, we just have one short comment from online, and it's from the presidency, who says, thank you for a beautiful conference, and that they are indeed listening and looking forward to engaging at a suitable time.
Thank you. So let me turn over to the panel, and we'll go in reverse order this time. So starting with you, Erin.
I have to say, I used to work at a bookshop and we'd do launches, and at the end there'd be a Q&A, and we'd often have people say, this is more of a comment than a question. And I think we've had valuable comments, and it speaks to a kind of discussion that clearly this conference has prompted that will move forward. So that's incredibly positive. There are many different areas it touches on: gender issues, the role of civil society, how to mobilize the public, framing of things. I could go on. But there are just a couple of things I did hear as direct questions I want to touch on. The issue of a PIA application, I would say go for it. There are many obstacles. You will need to work on trying to find someone who can do it pro bono, who is skilled. I know Open Secrets has a fair amount of experience in doing PIA applications, and there may well be other organizations that want the same information that you do on BANE. So I would say give it your best shot, and even if you fail, you can demonstrate that you are seeking information from the Commission, and if you win, it could set precedent for other organizations seeking that kind of information. So go for it. Then in terms of measuring implementation, Zen spoken about a tracker, Mike touched on that as well. I do think about naming people who have been mentioned in the report as liable for a prima facie case of corruption, money laundering, kickbacks, you name it. You'll find a few of them in Parliament, which I think is an absolute indictment on the ANC's lip service about holding people accountable for state capture. There are MPs who hold serious positions on government committees in Parliament right now who shouldn't be there, simply for the sake of appearance. There is a lack of shame in this country when it comes to our political leaders, and we do not call them out enough on their contradictions. Then also in terms of tracking people, Salim Essa, he's been named by the US Treasury, he's been named by the UK in terms of sanctions. From what I understand, he is still traveling on a South African passport. That's information I should credit Outer for raising, and so it should be easy enough to find him. Also, of course, the matter of extraditing the two Gupta brothers who need to come back to this country. And just one thing on that, I think a point that may have not been emphasized enough over the last 2 days from what I've been able to catch is the issue of sovereignty. It comes up in relation to the Guptas' role in, threatening the country's rule of law, evidence from the SSA witnesses at the Zondo Commission on how the Guptas and their influence was flagged as a threat to South Africa's national security, its sovereignty, and then also in the very good book on nuclear, which Karen Morn and Kirsten Pearson did, which draws on evidence from the Zondo Commission. And I do think that's an important thing to remember, because the impunity at the Commission, most pointedly on the part of our former head of state, has drawn us into a period of great sovereignty instability. And we saw that in the middle of last year. And we need to remember that, and we need to remember the impunity of someone like Dudu Myeni, former chair of SAA, who simply flouted the rules of the Commission on keeping the identities of a whistleblower secret. And so let's not lose sight of those things and how the tentacles of that sort of state capture era behavior have woven into where we are now and do threaten the stability of the country presently. Right, active citizen movement, good luck people, I will report on it as it happens. The point of the cost of the Commission, just to say, I think the 1 billion conservative estimate is also very dated. That was as the Commission was still in place, and we should be asking, and maybe I should be putting in a question on how much it's actually cost us to date. And then I would say, Dave, I'd go for Steinhoff, personally. I'd love to see Margaret Jooste not having access to his show ponies and his glitzy dinners, and I do think it would rally public support, but, that for what it's worth. And then the presidency, great that they're listening. Could they please also give us an update on Phala Phala and actually put a final version on record? And then I just wanted to follow up on my undertaking to give you the figures that the Minister of Justice gave us in February. This was in the SONA debate, and he promised that the ID was working on, let me just double check, it was 37 matters that the ID was seized with, 14 of which had been enrolled by February, and he'd promised 3 seminal cases for enrollment in March. That didn't happen in March. And then in a written reply in August, 31st of August I think it was, he said the NPA was working on 9 seminal enroll cases in the next 6 months. But we know that Shamala Batoy had mentioned 6 months back in April, May. So the numbers are all over the show. We need to keep tabs on that, and we need to make sure that winnable cases of state capture go through the courts and get won, let's hope. Thank you.
Yeah, also going to cherry pick from a lot of the comments from the room to some of the major ones that stuck out to me to just focus on. And I think the one key thing that came through was this packaging of information and accessibility, and how I think we as civil society organizations, and I think definitely as the CSWG, that's something in the immediate next steps, we as civil society organizations working in these areas need to look at how we do that, and we need to revisit how we've done that, and think of new ways of how we do that. I think Corruption Watch's podcast, for example, that broke down some of the days of Zondo, I think is another of the examples of the ways we can package up this information in more accessible ways. And there's some thinking there for us to do as the CSWG and see how we take that forward. And the other comment of not working in silos as civil society, I think that's an important one, not only to build the coalitions that already are there, but how do we work across coalitions, I think is the really major important thing that we'll be thinking through and should be thinking through in I think the coming days in especially responding as civil society. I think, Zachary and I have had conversations between how we work with CSWG and defend our democracy, so as not to replicate, but also to draw on our strengths. And, we have Budget Justice Coalition, also part of the civil society working group. And so how do we work across not only the organizations within coalitions, but across coalitions to kind of in our response to this in the coming months. Campaigning for prosecutions, I think is where we galvanize and put our weight behind. I think in the next steps following, one of the most immediate ways we can respond and really applying pressure to the NPA, but beyond that, throwing our weight behind the companies and the individuals that are the key witness list. Actually, we put together as the civil society working group of witnesses that included individuals and companies we wanted to see called to the Zondo Commission. So I think really tracking those companies and individuals post the recommendations of the Commission and putting them on blast, I think is one of the quick ways we can respond in the next few days. No, not days, weeks and months, to really say these are the names and these are the faces, let's name and shame. And I think really focusing, just picking up from that point that David Lewis brought up about prioritizing strategically. I think linking to the point we have to prioritize and think strategically as civil society, but I don't think it's almost as simple as the trade-off between VBS and McKinsey. For example, when we look at Bain, what Bain has done in South Africa is gut the SARS, the country's tax revenue institution. And so when we're picking, I think, between Bain and what might not be an obvious to the layman public as someone, as a company to go behind, it links to, it's our job as civil society to kind of bridge that gap, and in our packaging of information to say, we are a state that is in dire need to respond to social issues with a grant that's worth more than 350 rand, and we're sitting with the tax revenue service that's been gutted by capacity, key amongst which included Bain for doing that. So I think the trade-off isn't as simple, but the prioritization is important, and how we make those decisions is for us to draw those connections. It is all linked, but there are important ways to draw those connections between Bain and SARS and the inability of the country to provide a social grant, because that's really what it boils down to. And I think in implementation of the recommendations in the coming ways as civil society, as we're thinking across coalitions and not in silos, and thinking about how we strategically place our power on pressure points that are important, it's also important for us to make those important links and to make that information accessible to the public. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Let me start by thanking you for the contributions. I think that you've given us food for thought. There were questions, but I think in large, I think I'm welcoming the comments, and I think we need to make sure that we take a lot of these suggestions forward. Just to do a little advert, I'm running a project at VETS. We are doing, it's a state capture project. So we're trying to do a deep dive into the report to make sure that we get a team of people who'll go through the report in great detail. We're inviting researchers to come and help us do an analysis of what's in the report. But most importantly, try to identify the systemic weaknesses that we have in our society that have created conditions for state capture to take place. So what are those weaknesses? And we're hoping that over the next few months, we'll be able to come up with a report, possibly even a book at a later stage to actually deal with these kinds of issues. But what's important is that we need to find a way of also understanding who's doing what, because there's just so much work being done by different players. There isn't enough sharing of information. Just to respond to some of the issues, not everything. I think a lot of the comments, the contributions were comments. What can be done to support civil society? I think that we need to put pressure on business because I think that they have a role to play in making sure that this report is unpacked and that we actually plug all the weaknesses in our society that created conditions for state capture to take place. So I think we need to put pressure on them to fund, but also it is possible to go back to our international supporters in many parts of the world to say, this is what civil society is doing in the country and it needs support. Because if we rely on private sector alone, especially because part of the work that civil society does must actually point very sharp fingers at private sector and its role in state capture. So we shouldn't expect a lot of support from there, but still we can't let the private sector off the hook. So I think that it's work that needs to be done. Electoral reform, I think that was a comment. The issue of Chapter 9 institutions, I think that the report does cover that, especially with regard to the process of getting people appointed into these bodies, because we got to make sure that, I think that the president has quite a bit of power to make these kinds of appointments, but in many cases, we do end up with people of less quality being appointed into these Chapter 9 institutions. Parliament is supposed to play an oversight role to make sure that we get the right people appointed in these bodies. But I think that the system still has lots of loopholes that makes it possible for wrong people to get appointed into the structures, and individuals can also be captured. Individuals who are Chapter 9 institutions can be captured. So I'm sure we can think of numerous examples where people who are appointed into Chapter 9 institutions, despite a parliamentary process, ended up being appointed into the Chapter 9 institutions. How do we measure impact? I think that's a fundamental question. I don't know if anybody has a simple answer to that. It's something that I will incorporate in my project to find ways of making sure that we can measure the impact of the implementation of the recommendations. Role of the media, no question about it. It has played an important role, but we must remember that it's actually certain kind of media that has played an important role. Not all of the media, our errands of this world, have done a stunning work, Amabungan, stunning work, but to what extent do the work that the progressive media has done, reaching out to ordinary citizens? Radio still remains the most important, in my view, channel to reach out to the most ordinary people in many parts of the country, using vernacular or languages spoken by people in communities. I think it's very important to make sure that whatever we do becomes accessible and reaches out to each and every corner of our country. Difficulty is a lot of our media is focused and operating in urban areas, but we're losing out on the majority of people who are in peri-urban areas and rural areas. And there's plenty community media that's existing out there, and we are actually not utilizing them quite effectively. But we have to underscore the important role that media played in exposing wrongdoing in the state. Tracking of individuals implicated, I think that's absolutely vital. I fully support that. Demanding reparations, I underscore that. Need for mobilization, mass mobilization ahead of the president's announcement. I think that's absolutely vital. We gotta have to look beyond the major on a few civil society organizations that sit in gatherings of such nature. We need to look for youth organizations that operate in different parts of the country, women's organizations. There are many organizations that exist there that we need to reach out to. But also, organizations such as unions can actually play an important role. So I think that we need to go to the old days of the mass democratic movement to reach out to almost all parts of our society, the churches, civic associations, youth movements, student organizations. We've got to do a lot of mobilization, and there's a lot of work that can be done in that regard to make sure that we get the kind of support that you're talking about. But I underscore support fully the idea of a public voice emerging before the president speaks, so that the president must know that, in fact, there are great expectations from his announcement, and that our citizens are going to be alive and make sure that, in fact, the recommendations of the Zondo Commission gets attention. But as I said in my presentation, we've got to find a way of making sure that our response is not just on the Zondo Commission. The bigger issue is also the question of corruption that is becoming endemic in our society. Not all elements of corruption are covered in the Zondo report. And I think we need to make sure that we find a way of making sure that in our mobilization of society, we just raise the level of consciousness about the need to fight, to mount a major fight against corruption in general, and make sure that the ruling elite is aware that society is alive to the challenges. They need to identify issues that resonate with society. Fully agree with that, and I don't need to say much. The issue of scale and whether GCIS can play a role, unfortunately, that's not the GCIS's mandate. If anything, GCIS's role in this period will be to explain to the public what government is doing. So it will not even use a cent to support the kind of work that we are doing as government. And I think that I'm working on something on the side which will be just a question, a debate about the role of ethics and government communications, because I think that there are quite important issues that, dilemmas that are faced by government communicators. When there's a government that is perceived by ordinary people to be not delivering, with high levels of corruption, what role do government communicators play in that context? And I think that many of those who are working in the government system, which is GCIS, a government department essentially, how do those communicators deal with that dilemma? But GCIS as an entity supporting civil society and what we do, I think that I would say it's close to zero, because that's not the mandate of GCIS as far as I understand it. Following, can we give examples about what's happening in other parts of the world? An important part of my project. I mean, we just now in the process of getting in touch with a lot of international NGOs and universities that have done a thorough study. I'm glad you asked that question, because we are guilty of some kind of South Africanism. We think that state capture is a South African phenomena. It doesn't happen in any parts of the world. And there are numerous examples that we're being exposed to. So we're starting to compile case studies, but also draw comparisons and lessons from other countries. How have they dealt with the issue of state capture? Because it is not a uniquely South African concept. So we're looking at it from the perspective of southern countries or developing nations, how they've dealt with it, and how developed nations have also dealt with the issue of state capture. We'll see it exists in many parts of the world. So we're hoping that we'll work with civil society to bring some of those experts into the country to actually just share with us how have they dealt with the issue of state capture in the various parts of the world. What sort of legislative frameworks need to be put in place to make sure that we prevent state capture from taking place? Coordination between policy and departments, etc. I think it's an important issue. I'm starting to think that one of the major flaws in our analysis as a country is that we tend to say, to make the statement that there's nothing wrong with our policies, the problem is implementation. I think that's a flawed perspective. I think that the way in which you develop policies, our failure to make sure that in fact there is proper coordination and alignment in the various policies that we come up with as a country requires a lot of attention. We can look at, for example, the economic cluster in government. Firstly, somebody told me that there aren't enough meetings of the cluster to make sure there's coordination. But the fact that individual departments operating in the economic sphere are not making sure that they align their policies to achieve a common goal, so that we achieve a common goal as a country. You look at the situation that took place in where the mud crisis that we experienced a few days ago. Department of Minerals and Energy says, no, this is what we have done. This is our policy. Water Affairs says something else. Municipality says something else. So there's an issue about policy coordination and development that requires urgent attention in the country, but then different departments as well. We need to make sure that there's alignment. And then coming to the issue of how those policies get implemented, I think that that becomes a second major crisis that we're facing in the country. We aren't just implementing our policies, and that's why I started off with the notion of a crisis of governance in this country. I run lots of workshops, that's part of my job at VETS, with senior government officials talking about training, public policy, and one thing that shocks me to my system is the fact that just so many people are acting. If you're meeting with 30 government officials, I can tell you 60 or 40% of them will be in acting positions, which basically means that our capacity, ability to implement even the existing policies is extremely limited. I spoke to a forum of DGs in the governance cluster. I mean, I've been out of government for only 10 years. I could only recognize, I think, 4 or 5 people in that meeting. The rest were acting and also new. So that raises serious questions about continuity, skills, capacity, and also just intellectual property. We train people, we appoint them into senior positions, and because there's a fight between a minister and a DG, the DG leaves, somebody else comes in, and everything starts from scratch. There's elections, new mayors, new MECs, new premiers, new ministers appointed, and all of them operate as if they're starting from scratch. So in a sense, as a government, we're just not moving forward in ways that we could possibly be if we were better organized, with better policies and good capacity to implement government policies. So those are thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let me thank this panel for joining us. I think they've given us a lot of food for thought. There's going to be work done to take this forward, as we've said. So we'll be communicating. And Lawson, you're not escaping. Come back. As this panel leaves this stage, I'm going to just ask Lawson to step up while I step down to go and grab my laptop to say a few thank yous. Lawson, I'm going to ask you to join me on the stage for a second.
Thanks. So just a few closing remarks, but let me start with the sobering thought. We may not have had the final Zondo report as yet. As we know, the Chief Justice has made an application to the court to condone the late submission of his report to the President. It was late by a week, but he also wants to make some changes to the versions of the report that he did submit. So watch this space. We may not have seen the end of the Zondo reports, but I just want to reflect on the discussions over the last 2 days. And I think, a huge thank you for all of you that are here in the room, everybody that has participated online. I think we've had really engaging participation from people who have been online and asked questions and commented virtually. And I think it's really been an action-orientated focus to all of the discussions. What can we do rather than sort of just looking back and sort of regurgitating what's in the report, but actually trying to find solutions. And I think that's the benefit of having people in the front line, people who are subject matter experts on the various issues that we've touched upon, to actually bring that expertise to the fore so that we can, as I said yesterday in the opening, begin to craft and refine responses to the report and specifically its recommendations. In the course of this 2 days, we've only covered 5 or 6 topics that are covered in the Zonda reports. There's a whole range of other things. I mean, we've spoken a little bit just now about prosecutions and law enforcement agencies, but we haven't really touched on this. We haven't spoken about many other issues like the State Security Agency, which a significant part of the report is devoted to. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But aware that I'm standing between you and a drink, Tebogo, I'm not going to take up much more time. But just to, again, thank all of you for your presence, your participation, all of our panelists that, agreed, and to apologize to the panelists in particular, because we did postpone this conference at least 3 times. It was supposed to have happened a year ago, but we kept having to follow the delays necessitated upon us by the delay in the delivery of the reports. So a big thank you to all of those, and a big thank you to the staff at CASAC and at Parry for all the hard work in pulling this together. They really have been phenomenal. And a final word of thanks to the funders that made this conference possible, the Millennium Trust, as well as the Netherlands Embassy in South Africa that generously provided the resources for us to make this happen. So thank you all very much.
What I wanted to do, somebody else is getting their GPS on, but I mean, what I wanted to do is actually name some of the people who have made this possible in the room. So I want to thank Lawson, of course, for being our partner in getting this conference to where it is, to happen. And from the CASAC team, of course, Dan Mafura, with your GPS. And Marenia Hendricks. And from Parry, a special word of thanks to Sarah Many-Gibbet at the back there, to Pamela Ndlovu, right next to Sarah, and to Refilwe Ramaisa, who's not in the room, I don't think, oh, is she? Oh, of course, she's here. And to Lindy Wendlela. I also want to thank, on the communication side, Vishanti Arumugam at the back there, and Tsiamo Lerumo, who's also standing at the back there. The Solid Gold team at the back, we've been audible and visible. Thank you. I didn't get your names, I apologize. And to the UJ team who've kept us fed and watered, thank you very much. They will keep us watered some more, so please join us for a drink outside.